It was just a rainy night. A single dad driving home, a woman in uniform stranded by the roadside. He didn't ask her name. She didn't explain. He stopped anyway. Sometimes the smallest choices echo the loudest through our lives. Before we dive into this deeply human story of kindness, resilience, and quiet transformation, if stories like this move you, consider subscribing to our channel. We share real emotional narratives that remind us what truly matters. Now let's begin. A single dad helped a female soldier in the rain. Then she got a letter that changed everything. The rain had been falling for hours, thick and heavy, like it meant to scrub the world clean. It drummed on the motel sign above Madison Greer's head, each drop cold enough to bite through her uniform, soak her skin, and settle into her bones. She shifted her weight from one foot to the other, trying to stay upright as the wind whipped at her wet hair. The glassy-eyed clerk behind the reception desk barely looked up as he handed her back her military ID. No card, no room. Sorry, ma'am. His voice had all the warmth of the weather. Madison tucked the ID back into the inside pocket of her jacket and took a breath that trembled as it left her. She didn't argue, didn't beg. She just stepped back outside into the rain. Her duffel bag dragged against the pavement as she moved toward the road. Her boots were caked in slush, shoulders bowed under exhaustion, her breath fogging in the autumn chill. She'd tried 3 different places in the last 2 hours, and they'd all said the same thing. No vacancy, no cash accepted, no sympathy. The street was empty. The town was asleep. No headlights, no buses, no cabs. Just the rain and her. A neon open sign flickered in a convenience store across the street, but she didn't have the energy to cross. Her legs had started to cramp, the duffel strap digging into her shoulder like a punishment. A part of her, the small stubborn corner that had carried her through 14 years of service, kept walking anyway. 1 more block. 1 more mile. Maybe someone would stop. Maybe a pair of headlights cut through the downpour behind her. She didn't turn around at first. Cars had passed her for the last half hour, ignoring the uniform, the soaked pack, the way she stood like someone with nowhere left to go. But this one slowed. The engine idled behind her. She turned slowly, rain streaming down her face. The truck was old, dented, reliable. The kind of truck a man owns for 20 years and fixes himself. The window rolled down halfway, and a man leaned out, late 30s, maybe 40, a square jaw and dark, tired eyes under a damp baseball cap. "You need a ride?" he asked, voice low even. Madison didn't answer right away. She glanced at his hands. They were rough, calloused. Working hands. No twitchiness. No weapons. No flashing smile that meant something else. Just eyes that saw her, not a uniform, not a problem. Just her. Still she hesitated. "I'm not going far," he added. "But there's a diner a few blocks down. It's open late. You can dry off, get warm." The wind cut through her soaked clothes again, and that was answer enough. She nodded once and opened the door. The warmth hit her like a wave, stale coffee and motor oil, but better than the rain. She climbed in, closed the door, and settled the duffel on her lap like a shield. They didn't speak for the first few minutes. Just the swish of the windshield wipers and the hum of the engine. The truck creaked with every bump in the road. A stuffed dinosaur swung from the rearview mirror, its stitching worn, its tail half unraveled. She looked at him sideways. He didn't glance back. "You military?" he asked, still facing the road. "I was," she said, then corrected herself. Technically. Army, yeah." He nodded like he already knew. "I used to be a medic. Navy corpsman. Iraq." She blinked at him, surprised. He didn't look like it. But then neither did she anymore. "You out now?" she asked. "Long time. Got a kid now. Keeps me grounded." They reached the diner, a squat building with a flickering sign and glowing windows. It looked like a postcard from 30 years ago, cheap pie-hot coffee and nobody asking questions. He pulled into the lot and turned off the ignition. Madison reached for the door handle, but he stopped her. "You got somewhere to stay?" he asked. She shook her head. He reached into his back pocket and pulled out a folded 20, then opened the glove box and handed her a motel key. Room 4. Cheap keychain. Plastic tag. I keep a room at that place near the tracks, he said. Sometimes for guys coming out of detox. Sometimes for someone who just needs it. You can crash there. No strings. Madison stared at him. Why? He shrugged. Because someone once did it for me. She took the keys slowly, like it might disappear. You hungry? He asked. She started to shake her head, but her stomach answered for her. He smiled just a little. Let's get something warm then. Inside the diner, the waitress knew him. Called him Luke. Told him Ellie missed him tonight. He smiled, said he'd read her the bedtime story twice to make up for it. They sat in a booth by the window, steam curling from mugs of coffee between them. Madison stared at her reflection in the glass. Wet hair, red eyes, a woman on the edge, and realized it was the first time all day someone had looked at her like she wasn't broken. Luke didn't pry. He just ate his pie and offered her his half. She took it. When he dropped her off at the motel, she paused before getting out. Thanks, she said. He nodded. Get some rest. She walked to the room key, clenched in hand. But before going inside, she glanced back. The truck was still there, headlights glowing dimly through the mist, like he was waiting to make sure she'd made it in. She didn't wave. He didn't need it. But she stood in the doorway a long time, holding the key and thinking about how long it had been since someone stopped in the rain, and how sometimes it was enough to change everything. The motel room was barely bigger than a storage unit, with one flickering overhead light and the faint scent of mildew soaked into the walls. But to Madison, it felt like sanctuary. She peeled off her wet uniform with shaking hands and sank into the creaky mattress without even pulling back the covers. Her boots sat by the door, dripping quietly onto the mat. Her duffel bag rested beside them, everything she owned compressed into canvas and memory. Sleep came in fragments. Rain tapped at the window all night like it had something urgent to say. In her dreams, faces blurred people she'd served with people she couldn't save, people she tried not to remember. A door slammed somewhere down the hall and she jolted upright, heart pounding as if she were back in uniform, crouched behind sandbags waiting for orders that never came. When the sun finally rose pale and watery behind the clouds, Madison lay still for a long time, staring at the cracked ceiling. She'd survived Warzone's tribunal's betrayal. But somehow, waking up alone without purpose, without orders, this was harder. She reached for the folded motel key still on the nightstand and held it in her palm. It wasn't the room that mattered. It was the man who'd handed it to her without question. Luke. Just a name spoken once by the waitress. A man with quiet eyes, a little girl who missed bedtime stories, and a truck full of silence and warmth. She checked out of the motel 2 hours later. The clerk didn't recognize her. Guy who paid for it, he come here often? She asked. The clerk shrugged. Sometimes. He drops off the envelopes. Pays in advance for strangers. Don't talk much. How do you reach him? You don't? That was that. Madison stepped back out into the gray morning, her duffel slung across her back. She should have left it there, chalked it up to kindness from a stranger, and moved on. But something itched in her chest. Something unfinished. Something like hope. She headed toward the diner. The bell over the door jingled when she stepped inside. The place was mostly empty this early, save for a couple of elderly men reading newspapers and a teenager scrolling on his phone behind the counter. The same waitress from the night before appeared with a coffee pot and a warm smile. Back already, hungry looking for someone? Madison said. Luke. The waitress paused, eyes narrowing just slightly. You a friend? I'm trying to be. She studied Madison for a moment longer, then nodded. You just missed him. Works morning shifts 2 blocks over church maintenance. Try St. Joseph's. He's always early. The church loomed modestly at the edge of town, its stone steeple gray against the thick clouds. It wasn't fancy, but it had a quiet dignity, much like the man Madison hoped to find. She spotted him before he noticed her kneeling beside a flower bed, hands caked in damp soil. Sleeves rolled up his flannel shirt, stained with work and time. He was humming something low and tuneless. Madison stood at the gate for a moment, unsure what to say. Then he looked up, saw her, and nodded like he'd been expecting her all along. "You found the place," he said. "I wasn't sure if I should." Luke stood brushing his hands on his jeans. "If you had nowhere else to be, then, yeah, you should." She smiled faintly, arms crossed against the chill. "You help a lot of people, don't you?" He shrugged. "Used to need a lot of help myself." There was no pride in his voice, just truth. Madison followed him as he walked toward the side of the church where a rusted storage shed leaned wearily against the brick wall. He opened it and pulled out a set of tools, handing her a wrench without asking. "If you're staying, you might as well earn your keep." She grinned. Subtle. They worked in silence, fixing the broken hinges on a warped door, reattaching gutter brackets. Her hands remembered how to be useful. It felt good. Grounding. For the first time in weeks, the buzzing in her head dulled. Afterward, they sat on the back steps of the church, sipping lukewarm coffee from a thermos. "I used to be someone," she said quietly. "You still are." She didn't reply. Just watched the steam rise from her cup like smoke from a fire long burned out. "I'm not going to ask why you were walking in the rain," Luke said after a while. "But I know that kind of silence, the kind you wear like armor." Her eyes filled unexpectedly. She looked away. "I'm not used to people seeing through it." "Maybe you've been around the wrong people." She wanted to say something sharp, something defensive, but instead she just nodded. Luke stood, stretched, and pulled something from his pocket. It was a folded photograph, frayed at the edges. He handed it to her without explanation. In the picture, a young Luke smiled awkwardly, wearing fatigues, standing beside another man, taller, darker, laughing with an arm slung around Luke's shoulders. "My brother in arms," Luke said, "didn't make it home. I tried to save him. I didn't." Madison stared at the photo, her throat tightening. "I know that weight," she whispered. He nodded. "Then you know why I stop when I see someone in the rain." She held the picture with reverence, then handed it back. "You did more than stop," she said. "You made me feel human again." Luke said nothing, just nodded and pocketed the photo. As Madison walked away, the wind picked up, carrying the scent of damp leaves and earth. She didn't know where she was going yet, but for the first time in weeks, she wasn't afraid to find out. In her pocket, the motel key still rested like a promise. And behind her, Luke returned to the flowers, humming again, planting seeds he might never see bloom, but planting them anyway. The envelope was thick, stamped, sealed, and oddly formal, even by military standards. Madison found it wedged between junk mail and a pamphlet about veteran health services when she checked the small rusted mailbox at the transitional housing facility. She had only given out the address once to complete the paperwork for her upcoming administrative hearing. She tore the envelope open with her thumb, bracing herself for more bureaucracy, another form to complete another question, to defend another delay in the decision that would determine whether she received full veteran benefits or nothing at all. But the moment she read the first line, her breath caught. Supplemental testimony submitted. In support of subject Madison Greer, Lieutenant, retired. She blinked hard, reading the name again. Then again. It was real. Her fingers tightened around the paper as she scanned further. The language was formal government speak, dry and deliberate, but the content hit her like a sudden gust of wind. A man named Luke Harrison had submitted a first-hand account detailing a firefight in Fallujah, 2009. He had not been present during Madison's recent case, but his testimony tied to a separate but related incident years ago validated the pattern she had reported, repeated negligence of protocol by a high-ranking officer who now stood at the center of her tribunal. Luke's statement was calm, clear, and detailed, and deeply personal. "I don't know Lieutenant Greer beyond a brief meeting," he wrote, "but I've seen this before. I've carried the guilt of silence. If she has the courage to speak, then the least I can do is tell what I know." Madison sank onto the edge of her bed, hands trembling. The room felt suddenly too small, the air too sharp. She hadn't asked him. She hadn't even told him her full name. But he'd remembered. Somehow, in that short ride in that cold diner booth, he'd seen enough to believe her. Enough to risk being pulled into a system he had long since walked away from. And he'd done it anyway. The next day, Madison stood before the panel. 3 high-backed chairs, a long table, files and laptops, cold faces with warm words that didn't mean much. They asked her the same questions again. She gave the same answers. But this time, she wasn't alone. They acknowledged the supplemental testimony. Not just acknowledged it, changed the tone in the room. The woman in the center, a colonel with tired eyes and a no-nonsense tone, flipped through Luke's statement twice. Her voice softened. "You have someone speaking for you, Lieutenant? That doesn't happen often." Madison sat a little straighter. When it was over, they told her they would reach a decision within 2 weeks. She nodded, saluted, and walked out into the sunlight. The sky was finally clear. She didn't go back to her room, didn't feel like hiding between 4 cinder-block walls. Her feet led her down familiar sidewalks past brick buildings and faded flags until she found herself at the little diner again. The bell jingled when she walked in. The same waitress looked up from pouring coffee. "He's not here right now, honey," I know Madison replied. "I just needed to sit somewhere warm." The waitress gave her a look something between understanding and permission, then slid a coffee across the counter. "It's on the house." Madison sipped it slowly, letting the steam rise into her face. Then she pulled a folded note from her jacket. Not an official document. Just a thank-you letter. Personal. Honest. She had written it 3 times and torn it up each time. This version she kept. An hour later, she walked back to the church. The back gate was open. The leaves had started to turn the first golds and ambers of a slow-coming fall scattered along the gravel path. Luke was fixing a section of chain-link fence behind the playground. His jacket hung on a post, and Ellie, his daughter, sat cross-legged on a picnic bench nearby, drawing with markers on a notepad. When she saw Madison, her face lit up. "Dad, it's the rain lady." Luke looked up a wrench still in hand. "Madison," she offered a sheepish wave. "Your daughter's got a good memory." Ellie held up a drawing. "It's you. I drew your army jacket and your boots. Want it?" Madison knelt down, touched by the simple gesture. The picture was crude but sweet, her under a gray sky, a stick figure in camouflage, smiling faintly. "Thank you," she whispered. Luke came over, wiping his hands on his jeans. He didn't ask why she was there. She handed him the letter. "I didn't know how else to say thank you," she said, "but I wanted you to know what your words did." He took the note but didn't open it. Just tucked it into his back pocket like it was something sacred. "I meant them," he said simply. "I know." A beat of silence passed. Wind rustled through the playground slide. Birds chirped as if the world had decided to start singing again. "I didn't think anyone would stand up for me," Madison admitted. "Not after all this time. Not someone who didn't even know me." "I didn't need to know." Luke said. "I've seen enough to recognize the look in someone's eyes when they're carrying more than they should." He paused, then added quietly, "I know what it's like to speak out too late." Madison looked at him, then not as a stranger who'd offered kindness in the rain, but as a man with his own scars, his own ghosts. And something else, the quiet strength of someone who decided to keep showing up even when no one was watching. "Sometimes late is still right on time," she said. Ellie ran up and took her hand. "Want to stay for dinner?" Luke hesitated. "Only if you're not in a hurry." Madison smiled. For the first time in a long time, she wasn't. And in that small moment, under an open sky with leaves beginning to fall, 3 people sat on a porch with spaghetti and lemonade. And not a single one of them was alone. There were certain silences. Madison had grown used to those heavy leaden ones that settled between soldiers who'd seen too much. The kind that didn't require words because everyone already understood. But the silence between her and Luke was different. It wasn't heavy. It wasn't cold. It was steady. like the quiet hum of an engine that never failed to start. Like safety. That night after dinner, as Ellie curled up on the couch in her pajamas watching an old cartoon on low volume, Madison and Luke stood in the kitchen side by side rinsing dishes. The simplicity of it felt almost sacred, two adults sharing space not in a rush to fill it with small talk or retreat into solitude. "You always cook that much spaghetti?" Madison asked, nudging him with her elbow. Luke half smiled. Occupational hazard. Grew up in a big family. Cooking less than 5 servings feels unnatural. She looked at him. Then really looked at him, not just the tired eyes or the faint scar near his temple, but the quiet lines of someone who'd lived hard and chose to keep loving anyway. "Were they all like you?" she asked. He paused for a beat, drying his hands. "Some better, some worse. I was the one who left and didn't come back until too much had changed." There was no bitterness in his voice, just fact, just history. Madison leaned against the counter. "You ever talk about what happened over there?" Luke shook his head. "Not unless it helps somebody else." She understood that, understood it too well. He reached into a drawer and pulled out a folded paper yellowed at the corners. Carefully he opened it and laid it on the table. It was a photo, Luke and another soldier arms slung around each other laughing in desert sun. "That's Mason," he said quietly. "He didn't make it home. Got hit in an IED blast while we were transporting wounded." Madison sat slowly, her breath catching. She'd seen so many of these pictures, smiling faces, frozen in time, men and women who wouldn't get a second chapter. "I was the one driving," Luke said. "We were supposed to rotate, but I told him to rest. I thought—" He stopped the words, cracking mid-sentence. "You thought you were protecting him," Madison finished gently. He nodded. "Instead, I gave him the front seat." Silence again, but not empty. Charged. Deep. "I carry a list in my head," Madison said after a moment. "Names, faces, birthdays. Things I should have done differently." Luke looked up. "You too, doesn't everyone?" He shrugged. "Some people bury it. Some drink it away. I fix fences and feed people I'll never see again." Madison reached for the photo, traced the corner. "Do you ever feel like you're making up for something you can't fix?" Luke met her gaze. "Every day." And just like that, something inside her shifted. Not broken, not cracked, but opened. A door long sealed shut. The next morning, Madison visited the Community Resource Center, where she'd once attended a job readiness seminar she barely remembered. This time, she wasn't just passing through. She filled out an application for a part-time program assisting veterans with reintegration, something Maria Torres had mentioned in passing weeks ago, but Madison hadn't been ready for then. Now, she was. Afterward, she returned to the church not because she needed to, but because she wanted to. Luke was out back again this time, repairing a swing set. The metal frame, rusted but sturdy. "Need a hand," she called. He didn't look surprised to see her, just passed her a wrench like it was the most natural thing in the world. As they worked, he nodded toward Ellie, who was on the steps coloring. "She's why I didn't spiral after I got out," he said softly. "When you've got someone depending on you, it changes the way you process pain." Madison tightened a bolt. "You ever feel like you're just barely holding things together? Only on the days that end in E." She laughed, really laughed for the first time in what felt like years. Later, as they packed up the tools, Luke said, "You know, there's something I didn't tell you." Madison raised a brow. "That's ominous." He hesitated. "I didn't plan to testify. I didn't even know your full name until I heard the girl at the diner call you Lieutenant. I recognized the unit. Looked it up. What you were doing. It hit me." Madison waited, heart stilled. "You were trying to say what I never could, what I should have said when it was my turn." He met her eyes then, and there was nothing performative in it. No savior complex, no dramatic flair. Just a man who once walked away from his own truth and saw someone brave enough to do what he hadn't. I didn't want to fail you, too," he added. Madison felt tears prick the corners of her eyes, not from guilt, not even from sorrow, but from something deeper being seen. "I didn't think anyone noticed," she whispered. "I noticed," Luke said, "and I wasn't the only one." That night, as she walked back to her room under a cloud-streaked sky, Madison stopped at a mailbox on the corner. She held an envelope in her hand, a letter addressed not to an office or an appeal board, but to someone she hadn't spoken to in a long time, her younger brother Sam. He'd served, too. Left the military years before her. They hadn't spoken since the day she blew the whistle. He'd thought it was a betrayal, that she should have kept quiet. But now she wanted him to know she didn't walk away, and neither did the man who stood with her when she didn't even know she needed it. She slid the letter into the box, exhaled slowly, and looked up. Above her, the clouds had parted just enough to show a single, shining star. Not much, but just enough. The next Saturday morning was soft and golden, the kind of autumn day that made you believe the world hadn't given up on beauty just yet. Sunlight filtered through amber leaves as Madison walked up the cracked walkway to Luke's modest home. The porch creaked as she stepped onto it. For the first time in a long while, her heart was oddly light. She wasn't sure if she was visiting as a friend or just someone trying to hold on to what made her feel steady. The screen door opened before she could knock. Ellie stood there, all gap-toothed grin and sleepy eyes, wearing a hoodie 2 sizes too big and socks that didn't match. She didn't say hi or ask why Madison was there. She simply said, "You're just in time. We haven't started the pancakes yet." Madison blinked. That's very specific hospitality. Ellie shrugged. Dad always says people come back when they feel safe. Luke appeared behind her, wiping his hands on a towel, his hair still wet from the shower. "She's not wrong," he said, smiling. It was the first time Madison had seen him relaxed, unburdened by a wrench or a story. Just a man in his home on a Saturday flipping pancakes for a kid who still believed mornings were worth getting excited about. "You sure I'm not intruding?" Madison asked, hesitating on the step. Luke opened the door wider. "You sure you don't want blueberries in your pancakes?" That was his answer, and it was enough. They sat at the small table by the window, the kitchen warm with the smell of butter and cinnamon. Ellie chattered as she drew on the back of a grocery list, narrating a fantasy story about a brave lady soldier who built a secret treehouse for kids who had bad dreams. Madison listened with one elbow propped on the table, a smirk tugging at her lips. "She sounds like she has good taste in camouflage," she said. Ellie looked up. "You think so? I think she's kind of lonely. But she's good at pretending she isn't." Madison went still. Luke across the table didn't say a word, just glanced at his daughter, then at Madison. Children never needed to be taught how to see truth. They came with that gift. "I used to pretend a lot," Madison said, her voice low. "Still do sometimes." Ellie, unconcerned, returned to her drawing. Pretending is okay as long as someone notices you're doing it. The words landed like a stone in Madison's chest softly and all at once. She looked at Luke. He didn't say anything, he didn't have to. Later, Ellie tugged Madison outside to the small backyard, which was more weeds than grass, but charming in its own unruly way. A half-built treehouse stood off-center near the back fence, its wooden frame still raw and unfinished. "We started this last year," Ellie said, pointing up. "But Dad got too busy. He said one day we'll finish it when life slows down." Madison squinted up at the structure. "You think it ever will slow down?" Ellie asked. Madison nodded. "Nope," Ellie said cheerfully, "but we can still finish the treehouse anyway." It was the kind of logic only a child could deliver, and somehow it made more sense than anything Madison had heard in months. "I think we can work with that," she murmured. She stepped back and surveyed the project. "You got a hammer." Ellie grinned and darted toward the shed. Luke walked out onto the porch just as Madison rolled up her sleeves. "I'm not sure you know what you're signing up for." "I built field barracks in monsoons," Madison said. "I think I can handle a treehouse." Luke tilted his head. You're sure this isn't a tactical excuse to spend your Saturday with us, maybe? But at least I brought my own boots." They worked all afternoon, taking turns sawing, drilling balancing beams, while Ellie offered detailed architectural advice from the ground. Madison hadn't used her hands like this in years, not for anything that didn't involve signing forms, filling reports, or holding on through the night. As she drilled the last bolt into a crossbeam, she felt something inside her settle. A rhythm, a sense of place. It wasn't about building something tall or grand. It was about building something that didn't need to be perfect, only present. Just like people. By late afternoon, they sat on the porch steps with lemonade and tired arms. Ellie had passed out inside, curled up with her drawing pad still in hand. "She draws you a lot," Luke said. Madison chuckled. "I noticed. She told me last week that you reminded her of a hawk. A serious, strong kind of quiet, but always watching." Madison laughed softly. "That might be the best compliment I've ever gotten." Luke looked at her then, not just across the porch, but into her. The way people do when they've stopped being afraid to ask the questions that matter. "You ever think about staying?" The words hung in the air. Madison didn't flinch. "Sometimes," she said. "But I don't know if I know how." "You learn by trying," he said. "Same way you learn how to hold a hammer or read a kid's mind." She looked out over the yard, the treehouse standing proudly in the late light. "Maybe it's not about staying," she said slowly. "Maybe it's about choosing where to return to." Luke nodded. "That's a good place to start." As the sun dipped below the trees and evening stretched out over the quiet neighborhood, Madison felt a peace she hadn't trusted in years. Not because everything was perfect. Not because her past was erased or her future guaranteed. But because, for once, someone had noticed she was pretending, and simply chose to stay. Not to fix her, just to build something beside her, even if it started with a crooked treehouse and blueberry pancakes. By the time Madison stepped into the low-slung brick building labeled Veteran Resource and Renewal Center, the scent of brewed coffee and dry paper filled the air. It wasn't warm in the cozy sense more institutional, lined with posters about PTSD workshops and nutrition, but it was familiar, predictable, safe. She stood just inside the doorway, watching a group of 5 men and women gathered around a long table, listening intently to a petite woman in her 50s with short, silver-streaked hair and a clipboard. She was mid-sentence, but paused when she noticed Madison. "You must be Lieutenant Greer," the woman said with a nod of recognition. "Maria Torres." Maria walked over, her presence calm but commanding, the kind of person who didn't need volume to be heard. Her handshake was firm and her eyes clear, intelligent, missed nothing. "We've been following your hearing," Maria said without preamble. "I've read your reports. What you did was brave." Madison offered a polite smile. "Some people would say it was reckless." Maria returned a knowing look. "Usually the ones it exposes." Madison exhaled softly. "I'm not here for congratulations. I'm just trying to figure out where I fit now. You and half the people in this building." Maria gestured for her to follow. "Come, sit in for the second half of today's workshop. No pressure to speak. Just observe." They entered the back of the room. A circle of veterans sat, some in uniform, some in plain clothes, all bearing the quiet exhaustion of people who had returned from something no one else could see. Their faces were lined with years, stories, guilt, strength. Madison knew those expressions intimately. "Today's topic is re-entry identity," Maria continued. "Who you were in service, who you think you're supposed to be now, who you're allowed to become." One man spoke up first, maybe 50 hands, rough knees, bouncing with nervous energy. "I feel like I was important once. Now I just get in the way at the grocery store." A woman added, "I can't even sleep next to my husband anymore." He breathes too softly. "I wake up thinking I've lost someone." Heads nodded, murmured agreements, and then a long silence. Maria turned to Madison. Lieutenant Madison stiffened slightly. She hadn't planned to talk, but the eyes around the room weren't demanding, just hopeful. She cleared her throat. I used to know exactly who I was. And then one day I said something that changed everything. I stood up for what I believed in, and lost my career, most of my friends, and a sense of belonging. Some days, I wonder if it was worth it. No one interrupted. Madison continued. But a stranger stopped in the rain one night. He didn't know me, didn't ask what I'd done. He just saw I was tired and wet and alone, and for the first time in months I didn't feel invisible. The room was still. It reminded me that the uniform wasn't the only thing that made me worth saving. Maria, her voice soft, said, "That's the kind of reminder most of us need." After the session, Madison stepped into the hallway emotionally drained but strangely lighter. Maria walked beside her. "I'd like you to consider joining our peer support facilitation program," she said. "You've got experience. And, more importantly, you've got presence." Madison raised an eyebrow. "Presence. People listen when you speak, because you only speak when it matters." Madison laughed under her breath. "I've been accused of being too quiet." "Then let me reframe it," Maria said. "You don't waste air. That's rare." Madison didn't give her answer right away, but something inside her already knew. That evening, Madison made her way back to Luke's place. She hadn't called ahead. Somehow, she didn't think she had to. The porch light was already on when she arrived. Ellie was lying on her stomach in the living room drawing what looked like a castle with antennas. Luke sat on the couch reading an old paperback glasses sliding halfway down his nose. When Madison stepped inside, Ellie looked up and announced, "I drew you again." Madison laughed. "Oh, what am I doing this time?" Ellie held up the picture. It was a stick figure version of Madison standing in front of a classroom of other stick figures, all of them smiling. "You're helping the ones with invisible OEs," she explained. "Like Daddy's shoulder, but in their heads." Madison blinked. Luke set his book aside. "You okay?" She nodded slowly. I think I might have found something today. Or maybe it found me." He waited. I was in a room full of people carrying things no one else could see, and they weren't pretending they were fine. I didn't either, and it felt honest. Luke's voice was steady. "That's more rare than you think." She walked over to the couch, sat beside him. "Maria thinks I could help. Not with answers, just by being there. Holding space." Luke smiled. "Funny. That's how I see what I do every day. I don't fix the fence so people stop falling down. I fix it so they know someone still cares if they fall." Madison looked at him. "You think I can do that too. I think you've already started." Much later that night, as Luke tucked Ellie into bed, she whispered something that made him pause. "Daddy." "Yeah. When people help, does that make them family?" He smiled and brushed her hair back. "Sometimes, yeah. The best kind. The kind you choose." Ellie yawned. "Then I think Madison's family." Luke didn't answer right away, just kissed her forehead and turned off the lamp. In the hallway, Madison waited, eyes misty. She'd heard it. "Didn't mean to eavesdrop," she said softly. "I'm glad you did." They stood there in the half-light, something unsaid lingering between them. Not romantic, not quite, at least not yet, but real, rooted, growing. Because sometimes when the rain doesn't choose sides, neither do the people who reach out their hands. And Madison was starting to believe. Maybe she'd been chosen too. The sky darkened faster than usual that Wednesday, as if the clouds themselves were remembering something heavy. By late afternoon, the wind had picked up, whistling through the gutters like a warning. Madison stared out the window of the community center, watching leaves swirl across the parking lot. She was supposed to lead her first peer support session that evening. Maria had told her she was ready. The veterans trusted her. She'd earned this moment. But she couldn't shake the heaviness in her chest. Something was wrong. An hour later at Luke's house, the phone buzzed repeatedly on the counter. Luke silenced it with a sigh. He was standing over the stove, stirring a pot of soup with one hand, rubbing his temples with the other. Ellie lay on the couch, pale and groggy cheeks flushed with fever. He'd already called off his shift at the church and the part-time night job he'd recently picked up to cover repairs on the truck. He couldn't afford to miss it, but Ellie came first. Always had. He placed a damp cloth across her forehead. Her eyes fluttered open. "Are you staying?" she mumbled. "Of course I'm staying," he whispered, brushing her hair back. "I'm right here." She nodded sleepily, her little hand curling around his finger. At the same moment, Madison pulled into the driveway with 2 paper bags balanced in her arms. She had picked up groceries after her orientation milk tea children's medicine and Luke's favorite instant coffee. She hadn't planned to stay, but something told her he might need backup. The door creaked open before she could knock. Luke looked exhausted, his flannel sleeves rolled up the worry plane in the lines around his eyes. She, "Okay?" Madison asked, gently stepping in. "She's burning up," he said. "I've been giving her fluids, but her breathing's shallow. If it doesn't break by morning, we'll need to go in." Madison set the bags down and knelt beside Ellie, touching the girl's clammy skin. "Let me help," she said softly. "You look like you haven't slept since last year." Luke didn't argue. He just sat heavily at the kitchen table, eyes distant, hand pressed to the back of his neck like he was holding himself together by instinct alone. As the rain began to lash against the windows, Madison made tea and brought him a cup. He stared into it like it held some kind of answer. "She's all I've got," he said finally, voice rough. "I know," Madison said. "No, I mean she's all I've got. There's no backup plan. No family to call. No one to take her if something happens to me. If I fall apart, you won't." He looked at her hollow and bare. "I can't afford to." Madison sat across from him, steady and firm. "Then let me be the part you lean on." His jaw tightened. "You shouldn't have to." "Maybe not," she said. "But you stopped for me in the rain. You didn't have to then, either." Silence. Then almost too softly to hear, he murmured, "I'm scared." Madison reached across the table, her hand closing over his. "You don't have to be. Not alone." The night deepened. Thunder rolled low across the hills. Madison stayed. She helped Luke sponge Ellie's forehead, read her books aloud when she stirred, and sat with Luke through the long stretches of quiet. At 2 a.m., the fever finally broke. Ellie, still half asleep, murmured, "Did the storm go away?" Madison kissed her temple. "Not yet, sweetheart. But we're here with you." In the living room, Luke exhaled so deeply it was almost a sob. He rubbed his face and stood slowly, muscles aching from tension and hours of stillness. "Thank you," he said. "You didn't have to stay." "I wasn't leaving," Madison replied. And she meant it. The next morning brought a fragile calm. Sunlight broke through the clouds in streaks, drying the sidewalks and painting the wet leaves in shades of fire and gold. Ellie sat up on the couch, sipping warm broth. Madison sat beside her, gently braiding the girl's tangled hair. Luke stepped outside for a moment of air, the first he'd taken in what felt like days. When he came back in, he found Madison kneeling near Ellie's backpack, helping her sort out school papers and coloring pages. She looked up, smiled softly. "Guess I missed my session last night," she said. He tilted his head. "You led one here." She stood and brushed off her knees. "I never imagined myself part of a family again. Not like this. Not—" Quietly. Luke stepped closer. "It's not quiet. It's just not loud in the way we were trained to hear." He paused. "You could stay, you know. I mean, not permanently if you're not ready. Just longer. As long as you want." Madison looked at him. Not with fear, not with doubt, but with the steady, measured understanding of someone who'd known battlefields of every kind and finally found one worth defending with tenderness. "I already have," she said. That afternoon, after Ellie drifted into a deep, healing sleep, Madison stepped outside. The porch was warm in the late sun. She pulled out her notebook, the one she hadn't touched in months. She opened to a blank page and wrote one line, "You don't need to be strong alone." You just need someone who won't walk away." She closed the book gently. Inside, Luke was humming a familiar tune as he washed the soup pot. There were no trumpets, no victory parades, just two hands moving in rhythm and the quiet hum of a house that, for the first time in a long time, felt like home. The storm had come and passed, but what stayed behind was something far more powerful. The community center was quiet that morning. No footsteps in the hall, no shuffling chairs or murmured greetings. Just sunlight filtering through the dusty blinds and the soft click of Maria's pen tapping against her clipboard. Madison sat across from her in the office, hands folded over a piece of stationery. She had borrowed it from the front desk, a plain white page with a faint navy border. No emblem, no insignia, just space. The words were already written, in ink, in her own voice. Maria hadn't asked what was in the letter. She simply said, "When you're ready." Madison wasn't sure she was, but she was here, and that had to count for something. The night before, after Luke and Ellie had gone to bed, Madison had walked out onto the porch alone. The air was cool, still carrying the scent of the storm. She sat with her knees drawn up, the notebook open in her lap, heart heavier than she'd expected. She had meant to write something simple. A thank you, perhaps. A reflection on how far she had come. But what came out was something else entirely. It started with, "To the stranger who stopped in the rain. You didn't ask my name. You didn't ask what I had done or what I had lost. You only saw that I was cold-tired and human. And in a world that constantly asks us to prove our worth, that was the most radical kindness I've ever known." The rest of the letter spilled like breath slow, careful, full of things she hadn't allowed herself to say. She wrote about the day she filed her report, about the silence that followed, the colleagues who looked the other way, the commanding officer who called her emotional, the months of investigations, the nights she barely slept. She wrote about the fear that no one would ever believe her again. And then she wrote about him, Luke, how one act of decency cracked something open, how he never asked for anything in return, how Ellie's quiet acceptance healed places inside Madison that even the military couldn't reach. "You gave me shelter," she wrote, "but more than that, you gave me a reason to believe that the war I fought was not for nothing." When she finished the letter, she stared at it for a long time. It didn't feel like closure. It felt like continuation. Back in the present, Maria gestured toward the open door. "The group's starting. You still want to read it?" Madison nodded. "Yes, I think they need to hear it. I think I do." They entered the common room. A dozen veterans sat in the circle, familiar faces now. One man with a prosthetic leg balanced a cup of coffee on his knee. A woman with salt and pepper braids nodded as Madison took her seat. Maria gave her a quiet nod. It was time. Madison cleared her throat. "I wrote this last night," she said. "I didn't know I needed to until I did. It's not directed at anyone in particular, but maybe you'll see parts of yourself in it." "I know I did." She unfolded the letter and began to read. Silence settled as she spoke, not the hollow kind, but full and reverent. Madison's voice didn't shake, not from fear, but from depth. Each word landed like a soft footfall on sacred ground. When she reached the end, her final line, "I am not healed, but I am no longer invisible." There wasn't applause, there were no cheers, only the kind of stillness that meant people were listening. And one by one, veterans began to nod. The man with the prosthetic whispered, "That's the first time I've heard someone say what I've felt." Another woman reached over and touched Madison's hand. "Thank you," she said simply, "for carrying that until the rest of us could hear it." Maria, standing in the back of the room, blinked back something close to tears. Later, she told Madison that letter was a mirror, and for the first time some of them saw their reflection and didn't look away. That afternoon, Madison placed a copy of the letter in a sealed envelope and handed it to Maria. "For the new guys," she said, In case they come in on a day I can't be here." Maria smiled. "You will always be here, even when you're not." Outside, the autumn wind picked up scattering leaves across the sidewalk like gold coins from a broken jar. Madison stood under the awning watching them fall. She thought about Luke, how he'd told her once that helping people wasn't about fixing them. It was about not walking away when the pain made them hard to love. She understood that now, because someone had stayed, and now so would she. That evening, Luke was back at the church repairing a leaky pipe when Madison arrived. She didn't say anything at first, just sat on the steps watching the golden light filter through the stained glass. He joined her after a while, wiping his hands on a rag, the familiar warmth of his presence settling beside her. She pulled the original letter from her bag and handed it to him. He unfolded it slowly, reading in silence. When he finished, he didn't say anything for a long time. Then, quietly, "You didn't have to say any of this." "I know," she replied, "but I wanted you to know how far one good man's choice can go." Luke looked at her. Really looked. "You're not invisible either," he said. And in that moment, no one was. Not the girl in the rain. Not the man with the wrench. Not the little girl inside sleeping peacefully for the first time in days. The letter had begun in the storm, but where it ended was here, in sunlight, with hearts still mending, but no longer alone. The first frost of the season came with little warning. A thin veil of silver clung to rooftops, curled around the edges of windows, and coated the town in a soft, silent shimmer. Madison rose early, tugging on a thick sweater, her breath visible in the dim kitchen light as she poured 2 mugs of coffee, one black one with cream. Luke would be arriving soon to help prep for the veterans' morning workshop. But even before he knocked, she heard the familiar rhythm of his boots on the porch. She opened the door with a smile. "Do you ever knock?" she asked. He lifted one brow. "Would it make me more polite, or just less predictable?" She handed him the coffee. "Both." Luke stepped inside, grateful for the warmth. His cheeks were pink from the chill, his eyes a little heavier than usual. "You all right?" Madison asked, closing the door behind him. He nodded, then hesitated. "Got a letter last night." Madison set her mug down. From who Luke pulled an envelope from his coat pocket. He handed it to her unsealed. Her eyes scanned the header center for veteran reintegration and community support position offer. Transitional support trainer. Her brows rose. "This is, they want me to join, full-time," Luke said. "Facilitate field workshops, train incoming volunteers, even speak on behalf of the center during community outreach events." Madison's heart jumped. "That's incredible." Luke didn't smile. I turned it down. The silence was sudden, sharp. "You what?" She said, not out of judgment, but disbelief. He ran a hand through his hair. "I've got Ellie. I've got the church work. I've got—" "You've got a chance to step into something bigger than you," Madison cut in gently. "You know that, right?" He looked at her. "I do, and it terrifies me." Madison sat on the armrest of the couch mug balanced on her knee. "Why?" she asked softer now. "Because I already tried being someone once, when I was a corpsman, when I thought maybe I mattered. And when I lost Mason, when I came back broken, I wasn't useful anymore. I was just a man who used to be something." She let his words hang in the air, let the truth of them settle like dust. Then she said, "You've never stopped being someone, Luke. You just stopped believing other people needed you. But they do." "I do." He looked away, jaw clenched. "I'm not sure I know how to lead anymore," he murmured. Madison got up, walked over and placed the letter back in his hand. Then, "Do it scared." Later that week, Luke accepted the offer. Quietly, no announcement, no celebration. Just a nod to Maria across the hall, a signature on a dotted line, and the understanding that he was finally walking back into something that had once broken him with new strength, and this time not alone. Madison watched from the doorway as he met with the program director, his posture straight, his voice calm. When their eyes met across the room, he gave her the smallest smile. It was enough. The following Sunday, Ellie stood proudly beside the nearly finished treehouse as Luke fastened the final railing into place. Madison helped secure the ladder, and the three of them stepped back to admire their handiwork. "Looks crooked," Luke said. "Looks real," Madison replied. Ellie twirled in the grass. "It looks like it belongs here," and that Madison thought was the whole point. That afternoon they set up a small picnic beneath the tree. Ellie arranged her dolls in a perfect row. Luke brought out sandwiches and too many napkins. Madison brought the last piece of her past that needed releasing, a folded letter she hadn't shown anyone. She'd written it to herself, to the soldier version of her, to the woman who thought courage was loud and lonely. You don't have to carry the burden alone to be brave. You just have to keep showing up even when you're tired, especially when you're tired. Luke noticed the letter in her hand. "Another one?" he asked. Madison smiled. "The last one." She tucked it beneath a stone by the treehouse base. A small ritual, a quiet goodbye. That evening, as twilight softened the sky, Luke pulled a small hand-carved plaque from his truck. Madison watched as he climbed up the treehouse ladder and nailed it above the entryway. When he came down, Ellie clapped. Madison leaned in to read the inscription. "Welcome home. No more rain, no more waiting. Just wood and nails and people choosing each other again and again." Back inside, Ellie fell asleep with a flashlight in hand and her favorite book open across her chest. Madison tucked the blanket around her shoulders. Luke stood in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression soft. "She loves you," he said quietly. Madison turned. "I love her." Luke took a step forward. "She's not the only one." The room seemed to hold its breath, and Madison, after all she had endured, didn't step back, didn't second-guess. She simply whispered, "I know." They didn't kiss. Not yet. But something passed between them, firm, unspoken, and more real than anything that could be rushed. A promise not of perfection, but of presence. Of staying. That night, as the wind gently rustled through the trees, Madison lay awake beneath the same roof she once hesitated to enter. She stared at the ceiling, her fingers laced over her chest, a smile tugging at the corners of her mouth. She wasn't fighting anymore. Not for validation. Not for survival. Just for joy. For peace. For the kind of love that showed up in the rain and never left. And maybe, just maybe, that was the kind that stayed. The knock came just after breakfast. Not rushed, not timid. 3 firm taps on the door like someone who belonged there, even if they hadn't been there before. Madison looked up from her cup of tea still warm in her hands. Luke glanced toward the front door with a flicker of curiosity. Ellie was coloring at the kitchen table, humming softly to herself, oblivious. Luke opened the door. A sharply dressed woman in her early 40s stood on the porch. Her dark wool coat was still dusted with the last flakes of morning frost. Her clipboard was tucked against her chest, but it was the badge clipped to her lapel that caught Madison's attention. Veteran Advocacy and Outreach, National Office. "Luke Harrison," the woman asked, glancing past him to the living room. "Yes," he said cautiously. She smiled. "You were referred by Maria Torres and the local reintegration board. May I come in?" Madison stood up instinctively. Luke stepped aside, motioning for her to enter. "I'm Joanna Fields," the woman said, her voice crisp but not unkind. "I'm part of the national initiative focused on expanding local veteran programs, particularly ones led by former service members like yourself." Luke nodded once, still unsure where this was headed. "You came across our radar after submitting your testimony for Lieutenant Madison Greer," she continued, now turning toward Madison. "And then again, when you accepted a support training role. We've been reviewing your background." Madison stepped closer, protective. Reviewing why, Joanna smiled, unshaken. "Because we believe stories like yours, both of yours, can do more than help individuals. They can inspire reform, community action, even national dialogue." Luke's brow furrowed. "I'm not a speaker. I'm not a poster child." Joanna nodded. That's exactly why we need you. Because you're real. Because you stopped when others didn't. Because you carry the story people need to hear. She pulled a sealed folder from her satchel and handed it to Luke. There's a summit in Washington next month, focused on rehumanizing the reintegration process. We'd like you to join the panel. Talk about what happens after the uniform comes off. We want your voice, your experience, your integrity. Luke opened the folder slowly. Inside was a formal invitation, reimbursement for travel, a speaking itinerary, his name printed in bold. He exhaled. I'm a single dad. We have accommodations for families. You'd all be welcome. Joanna looked between them both. You don't have to decide now. Just consider what a room full of decision-makers could learn from someone who chose kindness over convenience. After she left, silence filled the space. Ellie broke it first. Does this mean we get to go to Washington like in my book report? Madison knelt beside her. Maybe. It's a big deal. Ellie grinned. I could draw a map for us. Luke sat heavily on the arm of the couch invitation still open in his hands. I didn't ask for any of this. Madison sat beside him. Neither did I. But that didn't stop it from finding you. He looked at her. You think I should do it? She hesitated, not because she doubted his ability, but because she knew what he was really asking. Could he speak about what he'd buried? Could he stand in a room full of strangers and open the door to wounds long covered? You don't owe the world your story, she said gently. But if you're ready, if you want to use it to build something, then maybe this is the moment that story stops being about pain and starts being about purpose. Luke looked down at the folder again. I've spent years feeling like I didn't do enough, like kindness wasn't enough. Madison touched his hand. But it was. It is. You changed my life, Luke, that night in the rain. That wasn't small. That was everything. They talked about it over dinner. Madison, Luke, and Ellie, who was already suggesting they visit the Lincoln Memorial and some place that sells pancakes shaped like states. By nightfall, Luke had made his decision. Not with a speech, not with fanfare, but by quietly placing the folder on the kitchen table and beginning to fill out the acceptance form. The next few weeks moved quickly. Maria helped him prep with mock interviews and presentation tips. Madison rewrote parts of his old journal entries into outlines he could draw from. Ellie designed a tiny cardboard model of the Capitol building and insisted they practice his speech beside it. And through it all, something shifted between Luke and Madison, not rushed, not dramatic, but deeply rooted. They were no longer two people orbiting the same hurt. They were becoming partners in healing. The night before they left for Washington, Madison stepped onto the porch and found Luke leaning on the railing. His arms folded, his eyes searching the stars. "Can I tell you something?" he said. She joined him, nodding. "That night, I picked you up. I almost didn't stop." She turned to him, surprised. "I saw the uniform, the soaked bag, the look on your face, and I thought, she's just like me, and if I stop, I might have to feel something again." Madison waited, heart quiet. But I stopped, and I felt everything. And it was worth it. She reached for his hand. "I'm glad you did." They stood like that a long time, the night wrapped around them. Two people who had no intention of becoming heroes but had chosen decency when it mattered most. And now they were about to walk into a room that could echo that choice far beyond a rainy night on a lonely road. Because sometimes the knock that changes everything isn't the one on your door. It's the one you answered without expecting anything in return. And for Luke Harrison, that knock had already come. Now it was his turn to pass it forward. The stage lights were softer than Madison expected, more like a morning sun filtering through church windows than the sharp glare of a spotlight. Still, the large conference room hummed with quiet energy. Rows of listeners, veterans, counselors, lawmakers, students sat forward in their seats, eyes fixed on the man standing at the podium. Luke Harrison stood, steady hands resting lightly on the edges of the lectern. He wasn't wearing a suit, Just a simple button-down shirt, the sleeves rolled to his elbows, his boots scuffed but clean. He looked like what he was, a man who'd been through it and didn't need polish to prove he mattered. Madison sat near the front, Ellie on her lap, the child unusually still. She gripped her father's dog tags in one hand, twirling them absent-mindedly as if they were a talisman. Luke cleared his throat. The microphone caught even the smallest shift in his breath. Then he began. "I never imagined I'd be here," he said. "I'm not a general, not a politician, not a decorated hero. I'm just a single dad from a small town who once forgot he had something to offer." A hush settled across the room. There was a time I thought my story ended with regret. I thought the best thing I could do for the world was stay quiet, stay small, stay out of the way. I was wrong. He paused, glancing at Madison. She gave him a quiet nod, her chest tight. Because then one night in the rain I saw someone who looked like I felt, someone carrying things the world couldn't see. And I stopped. Just that. I stopped. He looked down at the lectern, his voice thickening. And that choice, it didn't just help her, it saved me too. He straightened, hands steady again. We talk a lot about serving, about sacrifice. But I've learned something in the years since I took off. The uniform service doesn't end when you come home. Sometimes it begins again, in quieter ways, with one act of kindness. One person choosing not to walk away. A ripple of stillness spread through the room. Some blinked back tears. Others simply sat with faces turned inward as if remembering their own moment, someone who stayed. Someone who saw them. Luke continued. You don't have to fix everything. You just have to show up. For your neighbor, your daughter, a stranger on the side of the road. Because the most lasting change doesn't happen in policy, it happens in presence. And then he ended with words that no one in the audience would forget. I didn't write a speech, I just wrote a letter once. And that letter came back to me not on paper but in the way someone chose to stay in my life. And in that staying, I found my place again. The standing ovation was slow to rise, but it rose. Not out of politeness, out of truth. Madison stood, tears in her eyes, Ellie clapping fiercely beside her. When Luke stepped off the stage, Madison met him halfway. She said nothing at first, only reached up and pulled him into a hug. A full, grounding, steady hug. "You did it," she whispered. He pulled back just enough to rest his forehead against hers. "No," he said. "We did." Later that evening, back in the small hotel room, Ellie fell asleep clutching her favorite stuffed animal and wearing a lanyard with her VIP youth guest badge proudly displayed. Luke and Madison sat on the balcony watching the city lights flicker beneath a soft navy sky. Neither of them spoke for a while. The silence was full, not empty. Finally, Madison reached into her bag and pulled out an envelope. A fresh one, handwritten. Luke looked at it surprised. Another letter. She smiled. The last one. "This time, I'm sending it." "To who?" She turned the envelope so he could read the name. "To any soldier who thinks the battle is over when the war ends." Luke blinked. "Where's it going?" "Maria's putting together a welcome package for veterans re-entering civilian life. This'll be part of it." She exhaled. They'll get a letter from someone who survived the silence. Someone who still believes that the rain doesn't mean the journey ends. It just makes the next step harder and more worth it. Luke reached for her hand. Their fingers twined together like it had always been meant that way. "I'm proud of you," he said. "I'm proud of us," she replied. Back home a week later, the treehouse stood taller somehow, even though no one had touched it since they left. Maybe it was the new coat of paint Ellie had begged for. Or maybe, just maybe, it stood taller because of what had been built around it. Trust, second chances, and a kind of love that wasn't rushed but earned. Madison walked into the backyard alone that afternoon and tucked another folded note beneath the plaque Luke had carved. It wasn't signed. It didn't have to be. "Dear whoever you are, I hope someone stops for you. I hope someone holds the door, brings the coffee, keeps the light on. Because you matter, even when the world forgets. And when the rain comes, and it will, I hope you remember this. The people who stay, the ones who see you, they are the miracle. The rain had come, but it was no longer where her story ended. It was where it began. We'd love to hear from you. Where are you watching from? And what part of this story resonated most with you? If this story touched your heart, please consider subscribing so you won't miss the next one. We share stories that inspire, heal, and remind us of the quiet strength in everyday kindness. Thank you so much for watching. Until next time, take care and keep believing in the goodness of people.